And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Alan Withers from Telent. Alan, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you.
Excellent stuff. Cool. So we've had a few conversations about some topics along the lines of procurement transformation and value generation within procurement. And we're here today to address the kind of core concept around taking procurement value beyond just supply chain savings. So it's a fairly broad area, but there's some quite specific points that we want to drill into and some questions that I've got for you in particular. So we can dive into that. We've got plenty of time to talk about it. I'm looking forward to covering these topics. Before we do that, for the benefit of people listening and watching, would you just be able to give a bit of background context on your experience, what you do now, but also be quite interested to just hear a little bit more about how you actually came into the procurement side of things, how you got into the industry.
Okay. How I got into the industry. Okay, so obviously I went to university, as I think most people do these days. Enjoyed it. Best 3 years of my life, probably. But I think what I recognise now is that I didn't really have too much of a forward plan. Graduated from university, did very well. Got myself my first job as a buyer for a company that bought and sold cable. So they were cable wholesalers, big company in what they do. They had a whole logistics arm to it. They had warehouses all over the world. So you bought cable and then you transported it to whatever warehouse needed it based on obviously what the software, the trending and predictions were telling you. So they started off there as a buyer. Now, like I say, lacked a lot of sort of foresight. So whereas my friends from university had a bit more of a plan what to do next, I had one friend who was a quantity surveyor and he went off to Dubai. I had a friend who was a teacher. She went off to China. I was sitting in a very cold, damp office in Erith. We were trying to count the years that I had left before I could retire. And it's a bubble burst once you leave university and you realise this is the world. So I couldn't. So I started to do a lot of overseas job applications, trying to look for my next adventure. Not much really happened for a few months, and then an opportunity occurred overseas in Angola, which now looking back, I think probably anyone who was more qualified to do the job probably would have just said no thanks, because they was willing to give me an opportunity. So I jumped at it, obviously, kind of told all the friends and family that I was off to find myself and look for a new adventure, and it was all part of my destiny. And so I went out there, and long story short, I spent 5 years out there working for a construction company, and learned a lot, probably a lot more than what I would have if I'd stayed in that in that position. So was out there for 5 years, and then came back, started working for a civil engineer. It actually worked out really well. Came back and worked for a civil engineering company who were just breaking out into the European markets.
All right.
Building data centres across Europe. And they, as they were just breaking into those markets, I came back with a bit more international experience than what they had. And it just worked nicely that, I could sit in there and sort of work with them and build that up. Left them, started working for Telent, and now I am the Senior Procurement Manager for Labour, which essentially is anything third-party spend. So we're looking at the contingent labour, the subcontractors, professional service, anything of that kind. Telent as a business is kind of split in three core competencies. That being transport network services and infrastructure services. And so my remit is to oversee all of that spend that goes across those three business units.
Yeah, and a couple of things I want to just pull up there. That's really interesting to hear that background. What an adventure going to Angola. You took a bit of a chance there, didn't you? I guess you could see it as that, but...
At the time I didn't. At the time I think it was probably youthful arrogance that I just, didn't fully consider any of the risks or what it meant. I just sort of jumped at it because, I think it was my idea of a 22-year-old's idea of an escape route, from the kind of norms of life. But yeah, now I look back at 35 and I'm a bit more kind of, what was I doing? It all worked out well, but my God, was it a jump?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I mean, as you were talking about the benefits of that experience, having put yourself out there, you took a risk and doing something different. You probably never been to Angola before.
Nope.
Probably didn't know a huge amount about it. Well, maybe the company. It's just a different scenario, long way from home.
Yep.
But the benefits of doing that, for example, coming back and working for the civil engineering company where they're doing overseas expansion, you've got more of an understanding of overseas markets and possibly some international stuff. Yep. That's where you get the benefits, isn't it? I think it's where you take the risks.
You do, absolutely. I think in that time, what I learned, I know we're going to be talking about it over today's conversations, but a country like Angola, it's heavily dependent on its relationships to get anything done.
Right.
So you learn that. There's also obviously cultural challenges. You've got to have empathy, understanding other people's points of view. And then, the procurement strategy, the core procurement strategies of how do you develop a supply chain in a country that hasn't yet set up, or if you're entering into that new market, how do you make sure that you've got that operational continuation and efficiency? So yeah, it was certainly the deep end. I look back at my career all the way through, and it's just a series of deep ends, one after the other.
But that's great. That appeals to me. I'm out of an entrepreneurial mindset, and one of the things that I see more and more in procurement is people with that kind of slightly rebellious entrepreneurial approach to things.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think one of the things that's quite similar about you and I is we both like getting stuff done.
Yeah.
And that's where, as I say, my kind of subject matter expertise is all around how organisations use different channels to get stuff done, get work done. The other side of it that I find quite interesting is how people actually end up going into procurement. So did you study a procurement-specific degree?
No, I didn't. No, I actually didn't. I studied joint honours, so it was effectively two degrees in one, history and English.
Ah, right, okay.
Yeah.
So when you went into that buyer role, what was it about that buyer role? Why did you go for that? Obviously, if you're going in as a graduate position, if you've got a good degree like history and English, then you can see why that's just a good degree to show capability of learning, level of intelligence, all that sort of stuff. But why did you choose to go for that role? So
what happened was I went to obviously university and I studied joint honours history and English because I've always had an interest in history, and English has just been something that I've been naturally good at. And it was when I was in your second year when you start to kind of house share with your friends and whatever else. And I house shared with a friend of mine who was studying business. He had a bit more of a direction of where he wanted to take it. And so as he was studying, we were talking more about the modules and the courses that he was on, and he was looking at supply chain management as a course, as a module of that course, and the supply chain, the kind of economical impacts, political impacts and things like that affect it. That's when I started to become more curious about what it is that is procurement, what is supply chain management and everything else. So when I left university, I had a bit more of a focus of where I think I wanted to go.
It's got, I don't want to try and make too much of a random connection here, but like if you look at history, a lot of it's about strategy and outcomes.
Absolutely.
And relationships. And so that has a bit of a connection. The English side of it, obviously you've got to be a good communicator, whatever language that might be in. So one of the areas I wanted to kind of go over with you first was just looking at your journey through procurement and also in terms of what you're doing right now at Telent. You've been doing some pretty cool stuff. And one of the things that we've talked about is this kind of potentially that there's in some areas there can be in procurement in general, there can be a little bit of a kind of legacy type attitude. And yet there's a massive amount of transformation, digital transformation, process transformation, etc., going on in procurement. And it almost feels like you can end up sometimes a little bit with businesses sitting in either one of the two camps, whether either they're cracking on and they're really trying to move with the times, or where some businesses may be a little bit stuck in kind of a legacy type process. What's your view on that in terms of what you see in the market and what you've seen through your journey?
So I think I was extremely fortunate to work for a company like Telent in that area, in the idea of transformation and change. They are, extremely open-minded when it comes to, let's adopt a new way of working, let's adopt, a new system, a new software that will improve our efficiencies. I think from what I'm seeing out in the market, this idea of procurement managing services, subcontractors, professional service, or anything of that kind, it's only now starting. It's the idea that what the traditional way of procurement, buying those boxes of widgets and digits and pallets, using that expertise and applying it into service management is only now starting to work its way through. So when I started with Telent, for an example, they had the foundations of good practice. They were doing a lot of good works as far as, obviously, for example, statement of works, what that actually means. Because getting a stakeholder population of 400 or 500 people alone to start adopting statement of works is a challenge, let alone applying a whole process of software and control and data pulling and whatever else. So they was already there, So I was very blessed to go and work for Telent, where obviously what we have done is now just the next chapter of that evolution, of that transformation. But what I'm seeing out in the market now is not as, I think, as forward as where we are.
Yeah, and in terms of kind of like making the case for change, that's going to be different inside every organisation. But, for you, having worked through COVID and seen some pretty extreme change over the last few years, what do you think are the kind of key things that organisations or people within procurement teams can leverage as that case for change, in sense of we have to move forward?
So, if we look at COVID, it was an awful time for all of us. But I think it was probably one of the one points in history where it really put procurement as a profession on the map, didn't it?
Yeah.
If we look at everything that happened around that time and after, with supply chain shortages, be that labour or chips or anything of that kind, Brexit's had an impact into it as well. Obviously, we all know where the markets are financially. There's been a lot more spotlight that's been put on procurement to get value back into their business for their shareholders and stakeholders. So it's only, I'm sure everyone that's obviously watching this today, everyone will have those success stories that they remember that they achieved for their business during that time. So it's only natural that those companies then say, that's great, procurement, thank you very much. What can you do over here? Now we've seen you in action and we've started to gain that confidence and trust. What else can you do over here? And I think that's why procurement is now starting to naturally push over towards services, because you can apply that traditional way of work for boxes of widgets and digits and put it within the service structure. And I think that's where I see it going.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that stood out about COVID was that organisations were in a situation where it's like alarm bells were ringing and stuff needed to be done urgently. Solutions needed to be found urgently.
Yep.
Procurement were the people that get stuff done.
Yeah.
Procurement were other people that could have the difficult conversations, that could come up with suggestions, that could make things happen fast, that could could work kind of like independently, use their initiative to come up with solutions. And it's a capacity that already existed for organisations, but I don't think they necessarily appreciated it as much as they possibly could do. There was that whole thing, a little bit like we're talking about with kind of like legacy and what's the case for change. That whole thing of like procurement being the police or being seen as the police within an organisation. I just feel like that should be pretty outdated now. If it's not in an organisation, then they're probably behind the times. But it felt to me like that was the view of like, these guys get stuff done.
Yeah, I mean, if we were looking at around about that time, the government announced furloughs, which means obviously there's a reduction in workforce, there's a reduction in outputs. A lot of in the industries that I've worked in, a lot of the contracts that were pipelined and expected all of a sudden got put on hold, put on freeze. So you've got a bit of a stagnation or a slowing down in those markets. So your clients and your supplier partners all of a sudden don't know what's happening in the next 6 months. So at that point, your company depends on the people that have had those relationships with those companies to either bring them closer together so you can work through those challenges, or bring them in so you've got an opportunity that you need to land very quickly. Can someone support you to do this? So yeah, it absolutely moved, I feel, procurement from being that, that perception of being a very transactional, you only speak to them if they want to moan at you about POs not being raised correctly or whatever else, and it brought them into we have a situation, what can you do to help support this? And I think really procurement, it found its place in the business, and rightly so. I think moving towards the transformation question you asked as well, and I think we spoke about this, is that the irony is it's much easier to sell change to a struggling company than it is a successful company. Typically when the going's good and everyone's quite happy with their kind of, their profits, why do we need to change? And I think again that's why I was lucky working for a company such as Telent, because they are, they really are successful and they're really doing, a lot of good work, but they're still open-minded to increasing those efficiencies where they can. But I've worked in companies before that where it has been a hard sell. It has been a hard sell to sit in front of your senior leadership and say, we need to make, a change here. I propose, we could do X, Y, and Z and increase this by, whatever amount, whatever the business case might be. But yeah, I think you've got to have a really open-minded senior leadership who, even when things are running smoothly, can actually take a step back and go, yeah, I see your point. We could actually achieve a lot more than what we're already doing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's a brilliant question or a brilliant point to raise. But also, if you're bringing people into your business who are entrepreneurial, get stuff done, they're going to make suggestions. They're going to be looking at how they can make improvements. That's how you retain talent. That's how you make your business better. That's how you make more profit, deliver better results to your customers, and make the business better overall. So it is clearly a thing that some organisations will be being complacent about. But as we've seen with the rapid changes in the kind of global economic climate, things happen so fast, companies can't afford to be so complacent.
You end up becoming the next Blockbuster Video, don't you? The company that was so sure of itself in the market that it didn't adopt new ways of work. And you just get overshadowed by Netflix. Exactly. That's what happens.
Yeah, exactly. So if we look at the way that that kind of evolution from this kind of legacy approach where it's very much kind of procurement in a box, the police, very basic, very transactional. One of the things that we've spoken about in the past is this kind of like broader understanding of the business. What is it that can give procurement that broader understanding, and what is it that helps them get that broader understanding?
So it sounds really simple, but for me, it's just understanding what it is that your company sells to its clients, and that isn't about reading the front page of the website and being able to repeat it. It's about knowing what it is that ladies and gents at the operational end of the business are doing, and how they're doing it, what they're using to do it, and how that ends up as the service or goods that you are then selling on to your clients. And I think you've got to have a strong idea of that as a starter, and then I think we speak about procurement. If you follow the philosophy that procurement are the department that brings value to shareholders and stakeholders in their company, value isn't just achieved at the bottom of a bid. It's not just about weighing up the most competitive and choosing that supplier. Value is also achieved by understanding what those people are doing at the operational side of the business, processes or softwares or programs or whatever else, and then being able to make strong proposals that say, if we did it this way, things could get a lot better. Because everyone has problems in their jobs. That's just a natural thing. Everyone goes home and speaks to their wives and their husbands and talks about the in their mind, the illogical issues that they've got. And I think the lucky thing about procurement, when it's done well, is that we cross over almost every department in the business. You know, you've got your finance, your HR, your, like I say, the operational end of the business, the commercial end of the business. So you need to know exactly what it is that your company's doing, you know, all the way through, not just the service or the goods that you're selling. And then you can start to strike those proposals of efficiencies along that way.
And I love that, because that just illustrates how integral procurement is or can be.
Yeah.
I think the sad thing is that in some organisations it's just not seen as like that, and the procurement team won't necessarily see themselves as that. That's kind of more the legacy end of the spectrum. But it's strategic. It's at the central point of so much information. I always think this just as a data kind of aggregator. Procurement can see what's going on inside the business in all sorts of different departments across the whole organisation, and they can see what's going on outside the business. You hear what suppliers are saying about what your business is doing. You hear about what suppliers are saying about how your teams are operating. You'll hear where suppliers are talking about great things that your teams are doing. You'll hear where suppliers are talking about ways that your teams are hindering them, for example.
Yep.
So it's just such a fulcrum of information that is absolutely critical, and we can talk about data in a bit, but where that data can be collected and used effectively, that's incredibly valuable information to pass up to the kind of C-suite to inform how that business can run most effectively. So I think that understanding of the organisation, as you say, is absolutely core to it, and the opportunity is there to get this kind of holistic view. You talked about driving value, and one of the things that we've spoken about before was in terms of, you know, what does that value mean? It's not just savings in the supply chain, and it's not just value in the supply chain. It's about, you've been talking to me about that kind of building the value in-house, but also building the value in the market. What's been your experience of doing that and taking that kind of broader approach, that kind of two-pronged approach of looking at what's going on inside the business and also outside the business?
Okay, so if I look at obviously the journey that we've just gone through to deliver on this strategy, you know, for Telent as an example. So Telent is a huge business. You know, really, really, really big business, and it has so many different competencies, so many different sort of benefits that we sell on to our clients. And what I first noticed when I joined Telent was that it was all being managed, you know, in silo, very much at an operational level,
right?
Which meant you had things like an enormous supply chain, some of which were duplicates of the same service,
right?
Or you had the same suppliers working in different pockets, and the cost discrepancies were enormous. So internally, it's about getting your arms around all of that, trying to make sense of it. Obviously, very simple category management in that regard, but you've got to get your arms around all of it, understand who's doing what, how much, why, and then try and apply some consistency and logic to it. Obviously, the services that we've got with you guys helps do that. And then also you've got to look at your markets. You know, so what do we do? What are our competitors doing? How can we do it better than them? How can we do it quicker than them? How can we do it more efficiently than them? You've got to keep an eye on that market. And then also on the same vein of that as well is, what is the client actually looking for? What are they looking when they approach us and they ask us to do a project or a service or what a package is? What is it that they're asking us to do, and how can we make their life easier along that way? And it happens internally to begin with. You know, as soon as you can gain your efficiencies in-house, you can then start to show that it reflects in the business that you do outside.
I love the fact that you're talking about thinking commercially, because this has been something that's come up in a few conversations I've had recently. Probably the sort of extreme example of that was a really cool conversation I had with a guy called Matt Meller, who was previously kind of running the procurement things at Madison Square Gardens. And he was talking about the kind of dual benefit of basically managing suppliers and driving value through that. But also, like in that scenario, your suppliers can also be your customers, in the sense that it's kind of like it can affect the front end. So basically, where you're doing an event at Madison Square Gardens and Floyd Mayweather boxing or whatever it might have been, and your cleaning company might want to be a sponsor, for example. It's probably not the best example, but what you're talking about is also that's going to impact the front end of a business like Telent as well, in terms of bids that you're doing with your end customers, in terms of the capability you can project to the outside world and what you can actually deliver. So that again is just additional value that we'll come onto it a bit later, or we'll come onto it in a second actually, but like measuring value and kind of like savings versus value, it's a tricky one, but it's a hurdle that's got to be overcome by procurement.
So this is an interesting topic, and it's one that kind of sits quite close to my heart in that area actually. So traditional procurement loves a savings tracker.
Yeah.
Okay. We love it. We do. I remember once talking to a purchasing manager that I used to work for, and he loved the rebate. Because it was easy savings, isn't it? You kind of the more I spend, the more you give me back, the more I can show for it. And it has its place. It definitely has its place. And I still have savings targets that I have to achieve each year. But then if you look at, for example, the SIPs learnings that they're rolling out now, it's no longer savings. It's the value for money.
Right.
So how do you achieve value for money? So you've got things that you've got to factor in, like whole life costs, and things of that nature, that shows the supplier that might come up the cheapest on a bid sheet might not give you the true cost efficiency that you would get from the middle range supplier, who will do all of the service wrap that you wouldn't get with the cheapest. So you've got to be able to measure value that way. And then also, and particularly in what we do as a business, it's about the value comes in from the supply chain based a lot of the time on relationship.
Yeah.
You've got to have a strong, and you were talking about the example of Madison Square Garden. The industries that we work in aren't the biggest. There isn't hundreds or thousands of suppliers that you can pick and choose from. Everyone's pretty much targeting the same work, and everyone's working together. So why not just get on with each other? It just makes more positive sense. So you've got to have, the value comes from the dependency and the reliance on each other. Having that supplier who's willing to support you, and then you support them on what opportunities that they're looking at, partnerships essentially. It also comes from understanding what you're doing and then refining it and perfecting it each time, and taking your suppliers along that journey with you. It's not fair to expect that you as a business are going through a great big transformation, and then all of a sudden you start mandating policy to them. You've got to speak to them and understand that what is their point of view, and how do we bring that along with us, because that's how you grow, and that's how you strengthen your market position.
Yeah, and we'll come on to it in a little bit, trying to diving into services specifically. But I think, driving value or value for money in services, you need to know what it is you're buying. You need to know how that changes. And if you're not capturing that information, it's just not going to happen. But I don't want to get on my soapbox too much about that. We'll come on to that in a bit. But so when you're looking at this kind of holistic view across the business, and you're working out how you can drive value, you're looking internally, pardon me, you're looking externally, but then there's the setup and the process side of things as well, which kind of, is just as important, sits there in the background. I sometimes feel that companies in some ways can be quite good at setup and process, but then they might miss the other two bits that they're looking at. It doesn't feel like many companies have got all three of those lined up in most cases. I don't know if you'd agree.
Yeah, I think you can become too rigid. You can become far too rigid and stuck in your process, that you're not willing to adapt or change to whatever factors kind of come your way, and then you can be too loose, and it's a free for all basically, and everyone's doing as they please. So there is that sweet middle, isn't there, where you've got your processes and they're well understood and they're well defined, but there is flex to them. Absolutely, it has to be flex to them. And certainly when you've got a holistic view of a company, similar to the size of Telent, where our clientele range is huge, each client likes something done a specific way. How do you then just all of a sudden land a process that fits all? You can't. You've got to be able to adapt to the challenges as they come.
Yeah, and so there, the underlying principle of understanding where the value comes from and driving that value is the priority, and the systems and processes have to be flexed to meet those needs effectively, which just makes logical business sense.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, when you're looking at a successful business that's doing pretty well already, but you're identifying not necessarily problems, but areas for improvement. It's a lot harder to, exactly like you were talking about, kind of the business case for change is harder in an organisation that's doing really well for change. But actually, from an individual point of view, being the person that puts your head above the parapet and says, by the way, there's some stuff we could be doing better. I'm not really very pleased with how this is working, and I think we should change it.
Yep.
It's much easier to just keep quiet. So how do you, what's been your experience? Is that something that's just natural to you in terms of facing those kind of uncomfortable realities?
So I often think about this myself, and I'm sure, okay, I'm going to answer that, and I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
So I wish I was someone who could just get on with the 9 to 5 of it. So you start in a company, you get taught a process, and you just follow that process blindly all the way through, and you just work your hours. It's not in my nature to be that way, and I think it starts to, I start asking questions, and I think that's the thing about procurement that I love, is that it's a profession that if you enjoy it, you will ask questions. You'll keep asking questions. Why? Getting to the point of how do we improve it? Why is it done that way? And so when I first started with Telent, and I got introduced, and this is the way that we do things. And I sat there for 6 months working on it, understanding the business, understanding what the stakeholders were doing. They had statements of work that were Microsoft Word pieces of paper, and it was okay. So I receive this and I review it, and I edit it, and I do the commercials and the contract, and I give it to you. What happens next? Okay, and then usually it was an answer that I didn't understand, and so it gets into that. My question was going to be, Johnny, obviously as a CEO to Zivio, how do you deal with that type of thing in your business? How are you? How do you face areas where you could improve it?
I can't help myself. I'm exactly like you in that respect, that I can't settle for it. I can't. Yeah. I won't keep quiet about it. I will make a nuisance of myself about stuff that I think needs to be changed. But also, I'm very happy to listen to people who've got greater expertise than me and other people's views on what is the solution. But I will always ask the question. And if I can get a satisfactory answer that actually what we're doing is the right way to do it, and that's totally fine, I'm happy with that.
Yep.
But I will always ask the question. I think it ties into that kind of like slightly rebellious, slightly entrepreneurial point of view. But I've always been like that.
So you've got to poke it for a bit.
Yeah.
You've got to poke it, see what comes from it. So what I experienced along that way is, like I say, so I started for 6 months. We had statements of work that were Microsoft Word pieces of paper. Once they were signed and approved, a purchase order was usually raised on the back of it, and it was managed. And so after a while, I realised that there was a lot more that we could do to make that slicker. So that's when I started to, in my head at least, build that business case of what we could do about it. And I think, I guess, to answer your question about how do you start pushing it along, obviously you can't. No one ever does anything on their own. You can't achieve anything in a company, certainly not in the size of Telent, on your own. So that's when I started bringing it back to my head of procurement and my business partner. Started to build and prove the business case to them, at least that we can make a lot more progress in already what we're doing. And it became what it is today. The business case obviously went through exec review and it got approved and whatever else. But I think you do need to have that, like you say, that kind of entrepreneurial perspective, that challenge. But then you also have to have strong backing from the business. It is a very brave person, a very strong-minded person, to be able to take a business case to a successful company and say, like, listen, folks, just want to stop you for 5 minutes. What we're doing is fantastic, but actually we could improve it. Because most people are very busy in their jobs and they don't want to hear room for improvement where there's no need for it. And it's another one that actually gets it over the line eventually, and then it's another one that actually proves it once it's landed. So I think there's levels to it. So you've got to have that entrepreneurial perspective, that need to constantly poke things. Then you've got to have some real strong leaders around you that help pick that up, and make it a reality, and then just the follow through.
And that's effectively the kind of recipe for success. And it's something that I can see in the work that you're doing at Telent. We've got other customers that we're working with where generally all of the customers that we're working with are doing stuff that's kind of like at the front end of that kind of transformation kind of continuum within procurement. But there's always somebody with that kind of slightly rebellious streak where they want to ask questions, that entrepreneurial attitude where just what we're already doing or just the current status quo isn't necessarily good enough, and they're willing to stick their neck out and push things forward. And those people need to be married up with the right companies where they'll get the executive support. People will listen to them. They're open-minded. We've got someone who's pushing a bright idea here. Let's let them roll with it. We'll convince me that that's a good business case for us to take forward. I do feel like that's the recipe for success because it's a catalyst. It creates movement.
Yeah. And
particularly in larger businesses, things can seem so static that it can seem like, how can we ever break this apart? There's always the potential for a million different people who are going, oh, you never do that, or it can't be done, or that's not possible, or we can't do that. And it does take people who've got that little kind of spark in them, I think, to start that moving along. But it also ties into another area which we'll kind of talk about. Well, I want to talk about later, which is that kind of support and mentoring side of it. In the sense, you've got to have that executive support. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of stuck in a little echo chamber, and your voice isn't going to get where it needs to.
Yeah.
Cool. So looking at that as the kind of structure and reasoning for actually moving things along, let's just dive into services specifically and have a little chat about that, because one of the things that I think was quite interesting, what you said earlier, was talking about the fact that there is already the way that procurement deals with spend management around goods and materials. I feel like that's a pretty well solved problem from a technology point of view, from a process point of view. It's something that's been organizations, software providers, academic institutions have been working on solving that for a long period of time. When it comes to services, there are fundamental differences. And what you were talking about was kind of applying procurement expertise to goods and materials. Most organizations are pretty good at that. Applying procurement expertise to services is something that's still quite early in its evolution, because in some ways, buying services has a more simplistic approach to it, in the sense that it's generally not a really complicated supply chain setup. But on the other hand of it, it's way more complicated because they're much more varied, much more nuanced. It's not just a fixed thing, like you say, a widget or a palette of X, Y, and Z. So I'd just be interested to understand kind of your thoughts around what needs to change or what's different about managing the procurement of services versus goods.
I think the whole when it comes to goods, what you're buying is very much, it's tangible. You can see it. You can physically go down to a warehouse probably and point at that and say that cost me 200 quid. And with that comes the benefit that you can then articulate or measure at least volume, discount, and from that relationship priority, and from that, your strategy for next year based on where the business wants to put their directions. So, for a procurement manager perspective, it's the comfort zone. Managing goods, obviously subject to obviously international challenges and whatever else. But it's ultimately much easier to control. You can fit everything. You can fit your whole supply chain quite comfortably in one CrowdJet. You can put your 80-20 methods to good work, and it's easier that way. Category management. When it comes to services, it's about, are you partnering up with the right companies? Are they working with your best intention? Are you giving them enough work to keep them to keep them happy, and you will be one of their priorities? Is the work that's being produced good quality work? Is the client happy with it? What is the future strategy in our company? How does that fit in with those suppliers? And then that's even before you get into the kind of the value. So what is the kind of cost implication? Is that market rate? Is that what you should be expecting to pay? There's a whole area when it comes to service. And then how do you measure successes based upon the services that you're receiving? How do you protect yourself with liabilities about what could go wrong? So it makes the whole management of those types of suppliers far more challenging.
And do you think that is one of the reasons why most organisations don't really have a good handle on services procurement?
Yeah, I think.
The reason I say that is because I talk to a lot of companies, and I'm very confident in saying that most organisations don't have an effective handle on services procurement anywhere near it.
Yeah, I think that there's the perception perhaps that it's a necessary evil of growth. So we are getting to a point now where we are far too big to have all this in-house. We need now to outsource X, Y, or Z to someone else to measure, and whatever the cost will be. I think there's also the idea that, again, the intangibility of the service. Well, how do I compare that apples to apples? How do I measure that? And then also there's the idea of, am I able to pass risk on to my supply chain? If this is my contract with my client, am I allowed to do that? What is my position on this? So there's lots involved that make it a very complex piece of work to manage services. And not to mention, obviously, you've got legislations and things like that obviously have an impact. So I think it's an area that's still maturing now in procurement. Like I said, I think product and goods has always been a comfort zone, but we're getting there. I think as a profession, I think a lot of people are starting to understand the value that can be achieved from it.
Yeah, as I was saying to you earlier, the recent sourcing industry group and Spend Matters research that's just come out, basically not really a huge surprise, but globally the split between goods and services across all goods and materials, and services, the spend across all sectors globally is about 50-50. But the area that's really growing is the procurement of services. So obviously that's going to differ. If it's a manufacturing organisation, it's going to be more skewed towards goods and materials, a lower amount of services, but growing. But in a lot of service-led industries like banking, finance, etc., it's going to be a very, very high percentage, high 90s.
Huge, yeah.
So, I would echo what you're saying in that it's quite complicated. And it's not really a problem that organisations have necessarily tried to address before. Firstly, it's an area that's been growing. So 10 years ago, it wasn't as important. 20 years ago, it was even less important. But also, it's been seen as too complicated. And, things like measuring value in services, just much more complicated and nuanced. And it's just been that whole kind of thing of like, we can't really do that. Just look at savings. And rightly, as you guys have realised, there's so much more to it than that. And there's so much more that can actually be done, but it does take an effort, and it does take, the attitude and the ability to change. But there's so much to gain in terms of savings, in terms of supplier relationships, in terms of supply chain resilience, in periods of market change, where if you're on top of it, instead of getting angry with a supplier for thinking that a project's overrun because of them, if you're tracking it properly and you know that it was something internal, for example, that made that overrun, you can be very happy with what that supplier is doing, and you can understand that, and you can maintain that great relationship. Or if they're not delivering, you can pick it up early enough that you can put things on the right track without it having to be Armageddon at a QBR. So I think there is a massive amount that can be done. I do, obviously working on the technology side, specifically around services procurement, I would put forward the argument that kind of legacy or traditional procurement technology has been much more focused around goods and materials. But I feel that that's come from the evolution of the ERP into kind of procure to pay and source to pay systems, where it was really all about the manufacturing supply chain at that point. And when you try and bend technology that's designed for the way that goods and materials slot in as quite a kind of, like you said, very structured, almost binary things, versus complex supply chain, services procurement is almost the flip side of that, in the sense that it's generally a simpler supply chain setup, but it's a very complicated thing that you're actually buying. I mean, what's been your experience from a technology point of view, as like going through the different roles and looking at different organizations, as to how much the technology is being geared towards that kind of goods and materials setup versus the more nuanced kind of services side?
So completely agree. I think ERP systems are more focused around the traditional purchases that a company would make, that being obviously products and goods. And so just to kind of give it an example, when we were managing our services via a statement of works that was on a Microsoft Word piece of paper, you then have to pass that into the into our system that raises the purchase order and obviously records the spend. But it's very one-dimensional. It's on the 1st of December, a purchase order was raised for £20,000 to this supplier to do this description. It doesn't consider everything that goes into a successful project delivery and an unsuccessful project delivery. So things like the changes, the variations, the accelerations of work, everything that goes into what is required to deliver that piece of work. So you've then got gaps in the process where if you're not on the ball, it gets lost. So that purchase order for £20,000 as an example, in reality now might be worth about £30,000, because those negotiations have gone on, at a face-to-face level. We need to do more. We need to do this. We need more of this, and you agree those costs and commercials, but it's not recorded. And then it comes to, let's say, 6 months' time, and supplier submits invoice, and it doesn't match up with the purchase order that was raised on the 1st of December. Well, what happens next? So that's because the ERP systems are one-dimensional, one price, one invoice, end of. Whereas systems that are being developed now, such as yours, they support the stakeholders from start to finish, and they consider everything that could go on in that time, like the variations and the changes and the de-scopes and the scope changes. So it's difficult to try and manage a service based on traditional systems.
Yeah, and as you say, most services, by their very nature, have the potential to be a bit of a movable feast. Scope can change, market factors can change, timings can change, and that's why, although there's more effort involved in writing a great scope of work, or ultimately what becomes a statement of work, where organisations are sophisticated enough to focus on real deliverables that they can kind of quantify or really describe, there's a lot to be gained versus the approach that some organisations take around services procurement, where it's all just like rate cards. Because ultimately, if consultancy A's rate card is cheaper than consultancy B, consultancy A, they get awarded the contract, but they take 3 times as long as they said they were going to do to complete it. It's not necessarily value. So I think people are getting more sophisticated with it now, and that obviously you guys are kind of at the front end of that type of process. And you mentioned the intangible nature of services.
They're snowflakes, aren't they? Every service is unique and different.
Yeah.
Even the same supplier working with them on the same projects, what you ask them to do tomorrow might not be the same thing you asked them to do last week. They're just different.
Yeah, and I think it's possibly the detail of it is one for us for a follow-up conversation. But assisting your stakeholders in being able to accurately describe what they want to do. I mean, partly the responsibility of that sort of thing lies with technology providers like ourselves to help solve that problem.
Yep.
But also it lies with procurement. And there's a lot that can be done, but that's such a fundamental part of it.
Specifying the requirement. Yeah, that's a long, ongoing challenge in any business about a service. Yeah, so it's about being able to articulate what you need someone else to do. And I was talking to a SIPS tutor once about tacit knowledge. So obviously the difference between explicit and tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is almost like muscle memory. You know, it's acquired over years of doing something repetitively that you just understand it. You know what you need to do, and then you're trying to explain it to someone else, and it's almost impossible.
It's like when someone knows how to play the guitar and they're trying to teach you how to play the guitar, and they just know how to do it.
So, example, I use this one. So Johnny, I'm guessing you drive.
Yes.
Okay, and so from your office to your home, I'm guessing you drive that.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing there's traffic lights along the way.
Yeah.
And how many are there?
1, 2, 3.
3 traffic lights.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, you've had to think about that. Okay. And for you to be able to articulate that to someone else at a moment's notice, it's a challenge because it's just for you, it's part of that memory. And so whenever procurement and their stakeholders are trying to scope out what needs to happen, you know, you've got engineers and you've got project managers who are excellent at what they do, you know, and then you try and ask them to explain it. And that's where the challenge kicks in. But then, and going back to the points that we've been talking about earlier on, that's why I do believe it is important for procurement to understand its business. You know, so for example, in my team, I work with a chap who, you know, we work in the rail industry as an example. You know, and before he worked for us, he was, you know, he was on the tracks. He was wearing the orange PPE and he was pulling the cable, and that is immense knowledge to have because, you know, similar to me when I've worked, you know, in the construction arena, you can go in and speak with the engineers, speak to the project managers, you know, on their level. And you can together start to brainstorm and map out those things. You can challenge them on what you think, you know, and ask questions, and they ask you questions, and that's how you develop that scope. You've got to understand what the business is doing, and then between you and those stakeholders, you then start to mature those requirements.
Yeah, it's that kind of theory versus reality, isn't
Yeah.
it? Because stuff will change, things happen. There's the reality of actually getting stuff done in real life, and the point you just made there. 100% agree, and it was actually the note I just made there was about it tying into the value and the strategy. So procurement might not be the subject matter expert on that particular technical task, for example, that's going to be outsourced to a service provider, but procurement will certainly be able to advise on the content and structure of that scope, of the stuff that people might need to include. Obviously, there's loads of cool stuff going on around, like using AI to help generate requirements, all that sort of stuff, which kind of takes people past the blank page. But ultimately, procurement influence can help make sure that the structure and content is as it should be. The buyer has ultimate responsibility for originating this is what I need somebody to do for me or for the business. And as long as it kind of can tie into how is this going to drive value for the organization? What is it? How does this align with the strategy of the organization? If you can be thinking like that, then suddenly it becomes a lot more structured and it becomes a lot more real. And it becomes a lot more tangible as to what it actually is.
Yep.
So it's one of those things that some organizations, I think they feel it's just impossible to get those to really describe what it is. And I know it might change anyway, but actually you can. If you take the approach you've just described, you can capture it. And also if you're capturing the way things change over time, it could be an agile process where you've got a series of sprints,
Yep.
where you're not necessarily understanding what sprint 4 is going to be at the point of sprint 1.
Yep.
It's an iterative process But as long as you're capturing those iterations in variation orders, change requests, whatever they might be called in a particular organisation, you're informing this living statement of work document that goes right through the process and always means that people are accountable. And I think, there's beauty in that accountability, really, isn't there?
Absolutely. Absolutely, there is beauty in accountability. I think it's consistency. Obviously, I mean, one of the things that I like about what we are doing now is the fact that in a year's time, a stakeholder can log in, view a statement of works that was written out to a service company from today, and understand what it was that they were doing and how they were doing it, so that it helps benefit them creating the next scopes that we're going to be writing for that company. It's that the whole point of lessons learned and continuous improvement is that you take it with you. I think I've once or twice attended lessons learned meetings in my life where it's a great workshop, things are getting really logged down and it's fantastic, and then at the end of a 2-hour call it gets saved, put in a file and never looked at again. It's accountability, and then it's using that accountability and making sure that it means something, value.
Yeah, exactly. Then you could be used for informed decision making. So that accountability and talking about the kind of the process, the changes that can happen, we're getting into like post-contract stuff there. Yep. So what I see in a lot of organisations is generally they won't have any information below PO level on services, but they will have some sort of a process to manage the up to the point of contract. Generally, that's where procurement kind of disappear out of the process, if they're even particularly involved in the first part, particularly when it's that kind of tail spend. And this is a kind of a debate we've spoken about a little bit previously, just in terms of that downstream responsibility. Because if procurement are purely targeted on savings, then kind of it's not really their bag or their concern. And if they haven't got the ability to manage it, the downstream stuff is kind of like outside their remit. But there's so much of the value is actually in that downstream part as well, that post-contract part. I think we both probably agree on the fact that there is a responsibility that sits with procurement or procurement can assist with that actually ties into the stuff that happens after the contract is signed.
Yeah, and I think strictly my opinion only here. I think yes, there is the idea that once contracts have been drafted, signed, and everyone's happy, and the PO's raised, and the works are then handed over to operational, that procurement then retreats to something else. I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think we should be as hands-on, but we should certainly be informed. And my case for that is that if anything was to go wrong along the delivery of those works, I would most likely be called up and asked to support. And if I don't know the full narrative, then I've once or twice put myself in some very embarrassing conversations where I've only heard one side of a story, and then you try and negotiate on the behalf, and it doesn't work out well. Then on top of that is, if I'm also speaking to the same service company about work that I need to be done on the other end of a business, I should make damn sure well that I know how they're working. How are they getting on with us with live works? Because if I just keep dropping bad suppliers into the mix because I think they're great, but no one's telling me anything else, I'm going to cause the business harm. And on the other side of that is that if we've got a company that's working for us and it's not going well, but actually it's us that need to change the way that we're doing something to help support them, then I know that I can incorporate that into the next thing that I'm giving them, So, yeah, there is the idea that once we sign contracts, it's over to you, Mr. Project Management, and away you go. This has all been written for you, but we should still be informed all the way through.
Yeah, and I think it's easier to just pass it over the fence when it's goods and materials, because it's just a question of then receipting, and it's all very simple and binary.
Get a goods in note and away you go.
Exactly. And with services, because of the fact that they're going to change, they're going to be extended, they're going to be added to, they're going to be there's going to be complications. Like you say, procurement don't want to get in the way of the delivery process.
We can't interfere. Yeah,
No.
you don't want to kind of be too much of an entity in a live project that you start to drown out what needs to happen. Yeah, absolutely.
But by the same token, if you've got visibility of what's happening, then when it comes to the point of looking at a quarterly business review, for example, then there's a clear understanding, there's a clear audit trail of, okay, this is where we've ended up, and that's changed because you agreed that, Mrs. Internal Stakeholder, and that's changed because you guys were a bit late with it,
Yep.
Supplier A. So you've got the visibility, you've got the audit trail, but ultimately the kind of where I feel like the responsibility kind of falls into that procurement process again is the question of, did you get what was contracted? Did the supplier deliver what was promised? And what was promised might have changed 15 times from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. But if you take all of that into account, did they do it? And did they do a good job? And that kind of qualitative feedback as well as the quantitative feedback, that's where you get into some interesting stuff around being able to actually compare suppliers, even if the projects they're working on are vastly different.
Yep.
Because you can look at, were they on time, on budget, at a milestone level?
Yep.
What's the percentage that they do that on every project they work on? How much scope creep do they typically introduce? What's their average cost overrun? What's their average win ratio? And then all of the qualitative side of it. Do they do a good job? Are they a diverse organisation? What's their sustainability criteria? How well are they, communicating or whatever it might be? So by not interfering with the process, but having a process that kind of captures this information, procurement can then see the end result, like in a goods and materials, just a simple receipting process. And that's where I feel there's a lot of potential value in informing the wider business.
Mm. Yeah, I 100% agree. And just to tie in, and this kind of feeds back to what we were talking about earlier on about traditional ERP systems just not being fit for purpose when it comes to this. How could you, using your example of agile work and sprints, how could you manage a statement of work that requires sprints, let's say 4, 5, 6 sprints along the way, all tied up with KPIs and SLAs of quality, on time, all of those things included? How could you couldn't raise that on a single PO, and then the variations and control of that alone would just not happen. I think, and to your point, you need to have, in essence, a storyline. The initial agreement was this. We all know that projects change, and this is how we've managed and controlled it. We've not allowed it to run away. And at the end, the final result was a happy client, a happy us, and a happy supplier, and that's where we've got to. You're more likely to achieve those 3 points if you've managed it all the way through.
Yeah. I had a conversation with a lady called Christine Stoltz the other day, and she said she's got a sign on her desk that says, "Nothing is unworkoutable." I hope I'm quoting that correctly. And this is where I want to kind of bring it into the conversation around relationship, supplier relations, because, some people might look at the idea of managing that delivery process or procurement having visibility of that delivery process more effectively. What's happening with each change? What's the audit trail? Who asked for that change? What's the reason for the change? Who accepted it? All those sorts of details. Some suppliers or some people might look at that and go, "Oh, that feels a bit like kind of micromanagement," but it's not. It's ultimately, if you don't have that information, if you've just got a PO and there are all these sprints and things are changing, it's very easy for an organisation to go, "Why the hell has this cost this much? You guys have gone way over budget. And it's not even finished yet. We're really angry with you. We're going to beat you up."
Yep.
Versus, if you're understanding everything that goes throughout the process, it gives you the opportunity to really maintain that relationship with the customer. So I'm just interested in your view, really, around the importance of the relationship side of it, and how that can be maintained when you're navigating issues with that kind of goal of value in mind.
So my opinion on supplier relationship is that it's utmost importance, really, certainly in what we do in services. Don't get me wrong, you have to have contracts. You have to have well drafted, contracts that protect you for whatever else. But as long as you've got a good relationship with a supplier, and it's you're managing it, and you know what they're doing, and they know what you're doing. More importantly, hopefully you should never have to draw that contract out and use it in vain. I would certainly say it's much easier to negotiate terms with a company that shares a co-destiny with you than an adversary. It makes for a very complicated conversation. If you do not share the same values and you do not have confidence in each other, whatever else, it is a struggle. So you've got to have relationships. Relationships are, certainly in the industries that we're working for, they are absolute. It's what it takes.
And we kind of touched on it earlier, but there's competition for suppliers.
Yep.
Particularly in this rapidly changing market, you need suppliers you can trust. They need to feel like an extended part of your workforce to a certain extent.
Yep.
Relationships are going to be extremely important in that. And from what we've discussed before, it sounds like communication is an extremely important part of that. But in the same way that a contract can kind of take the pressure off a conversation because it's the contract says this, we've agreed it, it's in black and white.
Yep.
If you've got accurate data capture, if you've got an accurate audit trail, would you say that potentially takes a bit of pressure off the actual personal conversation in the relationship?
It gives you a more informed conversation, doesn't it? So I think getting to the nuts and bolts of it, a contract is basically an agreement between two parties that says you are going to do this for me and I'm going to give that this to you, and if along the way this happens I can do this, and if along the way you can do that, and it's usually split of a good scenario versus a bad scenario. All going well, this is what's going to happen at the end, and all going bad, this is what I can use to beat you with. The bit in the middle is the relationship that makes sure that it stays on track, and if it doesn't, you keep it in line before it goes far too south. Great way of managing that, like you say, is data. So you need to see what the performance indicators are, the key performance indicators, what the SLAs are. You need to be monitoring those before they tip over into the red, and making sure that you escalate appropriately, that it then gets put back in place. So data used to support a contract, absolutely vital. Otherwise, you're just two people talking to each other about being supplier and client to each other. You have to have that data.
And it goes both ways, doesn't it? Because there might be data coming up that shows that the project is going off track for whatever reason. But if it's being captured, it gives the supplier an opportunity to say, just to flag it, the reason that this is going off track is because the key person with it at your end has just been off ill for the last 2 weeks, for example.
Yep.
And therefore, it gives them, it can maintain that relationship by having a clear understanding of what's happened and why it's happened. The other thing I was going to talk about was, you mentioned about kind of like having this co-destiny, this kind of cooperation. What do you think is the key to fostering that type of relationship with suppliers?
I think so. Co-destiny is the idea of being on the same path. So what you need, what you want, and what you need is aligned to what their ambitions are. I think it's important to have to have supply chain that shares the same values as you. That goes a long way. You should be making sure that do they match up with our 5-year plan, our ambitions, what we're looking for. Because they are a reflection of who you are, essentially. So you need to have that. I think you've also got to have a very open and trustworthy conversation with them, a relationship with them. Because you're going to be sharing things that you might not want to make public knowledge. But you need to be able to discuss it so that you can overcome it. So you've got to have a level of trust with each other that is real. It's true trust. So you've got to have direction. You've got to have confidence in each other, but you've also got to have, you've got to have an enthusiasm for each other. You've got to want to be working with them. When you think of your opportunities that you're talking to your clients about, you've got to be having, ideas that that's the person that we want to work with. That's the company that we want to work with, because that's how you grow together, just like any relationship.
And that builds so much value in this kind of extended capacity.
Yeah.
I was saying to you before we started the podcast conversation today, my real passion is about how organizations get work done and understanding that kind of capacity and capability. And if you've got a really excellent supply chain that you've got great relationships with, then you've got these problem solvers at your fingertips. And so therefore, when you're sitting down with a customer, I mean, have you been in situations where you've been sitting down, or you've looking at a customer demand and you're thinking, wow, I've got some people in my supply chain that could really sort that out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very arrogant perception to say, I am your client and I'm going to tell you how to do things. Because if that was true, most of your suppliers will say, well, just crack on and do it then. When you're talking to your service companies, your supply chains, you're not only sharing opportunity with them, you're sharing problem with them. You should be able to say to them, this is what we can't do, what's your solution? And then they come to you and go, we do this or we do that, and or they know things in the market that you don't, or they know innovations that you don't. So you have to share. You have to share your problems. You have to tell them, what your struggles are, because otherwise, you're just circling around, in the water trying to figure it out for yourself. And what's the old thing about doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for the same results?
Yeah.
So that's what you end up doing if you're not discussing and voicing it. And I think, you just have to share it, and they will come back to you with those solutions.
Okay, so around the relationship piece,
Yep.
I'll be interested in your perspectives, particularly in areas like the construction industry,
Yep.
about how the way that services are procured is fostering the kind of relationships and that kind of cooperation that is, as we've just talked about, the kind of gold standard. What have you seen, and what are the kind of good bits that you've taken from that?
Okay, so with regards to the construction industry, I guess it's an evolution. So if we were to go back in time, let's say 20, 30 years ago, construction and construction companies were very much self-sufficient. So you would be a bricklaying or a civil engineering or a scaffolding company, and that's what you provided, and your client would ask you to do something, you do it, and away you go. But certainly, I mean, anyone who's been to London or any of the big cities in the UK will see, the ask on these companies is just so great that not one company can do any of it on its own. It cannot happen. You would even need a labour force, on PAYE that goes into the thousands, which is high risk and costly, or the expense would just be huge. So what the construction industry has been doing over the last 20 or 30 years is getting better at subcontract management. So we are an SME. We are a tier one. We have picked up this piece of work from our client, but then we start to carve it up into packages and we let it out to subcontractors. And I think it was in the early 90s that was when I think a lot of the way that relationships were managed was very much tipped towards the big guys in the market. And then so industry leaders at the time were trying to make it a fairer way to work. So, for example, the NEC contracts were first drafted and first used. And they aren't just contracts set out as terms and conditions. They are a whole way of work. What is expected of you and what is expected of me and what can I do about it? And then if there's a problem along the way, how do we rectify it before it becomes a bigger problem? And what is the process of me raising my concerns to you, and what do you do about it? And how long, how much time do we have between doing that? So it's a whole relationship piece that it has taken, and it has started to grow because the the construction industry is just built on relationships now. It has to be. So those are the standards that I think have started to now move over into other industries, like what I'm working in now. And yeah, that's the direction that it's taken it. And I think from a procurement perspective, that's where we are now starting to catch up. You know, it's that understanding of the supply chain. It's the obviously the commercials and the contracting of that supply chain. It's the measurement of success, the measurement of failure. You know, what you do to rectify issues along the way, and then it's about building on those relationships to make sure that you do you have successful delivery of work time and time again, sharing your values with each other. All of that makes the co-destiny.
Yeah, and it just feels more strategic.
Yeah.
And it just strikes a chord with me, tying in with what you said right at the very beginning about understanding what your business does and understanding what the requirement is and what needs to be done. And if you've got that shared understanding between internal customers within your organization, procurement, and the supplier as well, that's when you can really build in that kind of cohesive cooperation that everyone is basically rowing towards the same destination.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we mentioned before that procurement sits at in a great position in a business because it should see everything that's going on. You know, if we were looking at it from a a very transactional point of view, you know, I've got, God knows, I can't even keep count of how many project managers I've got working, you know, in the business. Now, each one's going to have his or her own requirements. You know, all they see is their delivery. So they're going to come to me and say, I need this. And then if I just very much transactionally say, well, go speak to this company, off you go, you know, I'm not delivering on the service that I'm expected because I'm not telling that project manager anything about what they're getting themselves into with that supplier. You know, I'm not informing the supplier of anything that they should be expecting. I'm not helping mitigate risk for each other. And I'm not obviously opening up opportunities that are there amongst my other tens or hundreds of project managers that are all looking for the same thing. You know, so procurement, when done properly, is you know, at the cornerstone of all that strategy that goes on with the supply chain and how it interacts with your end user. Absolutely. And going back to what we said earlier on, you know, the only way I can become effective in what I do is understanding what it is that my operational side of the business does. And it's not just about, you know, well, we go and we install and commission these things. You know, it's about, well, what does a Monday look like? What does a Tuesday look like? What does a Wednesday look like? I have to do this and I have to fill out this form and I have to ask why. You know, because that's obviously going to have an impact on what they do, the supply chain does, and is that going to have a cost incurred or is that going to have an issue with them? And then, you know, that's how I start to build on those strategic partnerships. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love it. So kind of going to wrap things up now, but the last thing I really wanted to delve into with you, and this ties into what you just said around kind of like excellence in procurement and this ability to deliver value. Something I know is that you're quite passionate about as well, and this is something you brought up to me before, and I thought it was a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought about it, but it's basically mentoring in procurement and the importance of that. So I'm a fan of mentoring in all areas. I've got a lady who does brilliant mentoring for me just on an overall kind of business perspective, and she's absolutely amazing, and she's been hugely valuable. Yeah. But looking at it from a procurement point of view, can you just talk a little bit about your views and your experiences that you've had around mentoring?
Yeah, so I think to start with, I think, you know, mentoring is absolutely essential in our profession. It really is. I think you can teach good practices through a book. You know, you can teach contract life cycles and, you know, calculating return on investments and all that kind of good stuff, which is absolutely important. But what you get from mentoring is the soft skills. So emotional intelligence, negotiation, that supplier relationship piece, all of that good stuff that comes from, working with people. You pick that up much better if you've got a good mentor. Now, mentor doesn't necessarily have to be someone that sits with you for the next 10 years and tells you how you should do things and helps you kind of along your... if I look back at my career, my career so far has been dotted with mentors, where when I was out in Angola, for example, I worked with an absolutely fantastic operations director, and he was the guy that taught me as much as I know now about construction and civil engineering from a delivery perspective, what happens and how that happens and why it happens. When I came back to UK, my first opportunity, I worked with a finance director, and she gave me my first step back into the UK market. And she showed great patience, and she taught me a lot about what it takes to obviously run a business from a financial perspective and what's expected of procurement from a financial perspective. And now I look at my time, obviously, in the last 5 years, and I've been very lucky to work with some excellent procurement people, not all directly linked to service as such. They've come from manufacturing backgrounds or they've come from public sector. But that's the good thing about it, is that they each come with their own point of view, and I'm lucky enough to just be there absorbing all of that, So I think mentoring is absolutely fundamental in the future of procurement. And then if we look at, as we've just said, there's never been a greater time to work in procurement because of the things that have happened in the last few years, being such an emphasis on procurement, being a change maker for a business, driving efficiencies and value for a business. There should be more focus on procurement being the right, a good career choice. So you're going to find in the next few years a lot more interest in procurement as a profession, rather than most people just saying they stumbled in procurement because, it was whatever came up for them when they left school or college. People are going to start being more focused around, no, actually, that's where I want to go, and they aim towards it. It's an applied sort of career path. So, I think mentoring is an absolute vital piece in order for our profession to keep growing as it is, at the rate it is right now. I think I can only ever champion it, really.
And do you find that with the experience of the mentoring that you've had in your career thus far, do you find it's given you the ability to kind of step back and look at things a little bit?
I certainly step back at where I was 10 years ago and look at where I am now. And there's, I work with some procurement professionals who are at that early stage, and I kind of see things from their point of view because I once thought that way as well, and I try and give them as much support as I can and help them along their way. I think it helps. I think it's an important part of anyone's life that you can step back and take stock of what you are and where you are and what you're doing. Absolutely. I think it's strange as well. I mean, you just gave me the example of your mentors. Do you ever hear them in your head sometimes, when you're doing something and then you can hear them telling you about what they would do or whatever else? And I think that's so important that they have that presence in your future.
I think it's a hugely useful tool to be able to have people whose opinions you respect, and you've built up that respect for their opinions through a process like mentoring. Because then effectively you can almost run their opinion as a program in your head when you come to a decision point. You can kind of say, well, okay, what would they say to me? You're going to have a pretty good idea of what they're going to advise you on it. I think that's a hugely useful tool in life generally, to have a kind of like little bit of a hall of heroes where you've got some people that you can take a lead on. I like that about their approach. How would they apply it to this specific situation? So I think, absolutely, I do make use of that, definitely. And I think when you were talking about the changes that have happened in the last few years that have brought procurement to the prominence that it is at this moment in time, one of the things that you pointed out to me before, which I hadn't really kind of thought about, which I thought was a great point, was, well, new people coming into the market, they haven't worked through COVID. They don't know what it was like beforehand. They don't know what, and if we just, who knows what other changes are going to happen in the world. It feels like things just happen more and faster and more extreme these days, that because of the changes we've been through in the last, 5 years in the kind of global economic climate in general. But for new people coming into the market, they haven't been through that.
Well, I mean, if we look back at that time in COVID, when things were looking rather unexpected, you had half the workforce on furlough, which obviously had operational detriment towards any company. You had supply chain issues, and everything else. So again, going back to how this made procurement front and center, procurement had to learn to think on its feet very quickly. The agility and the kind of the ability to flex towards what the company needs, and all of the stuff like negotiation and supplier relationship and cost management and risk avoidance and things like that really took a couple gears up. And so that is now gold dust. That's the skills that we have acquired as professionals, that we will take with us for the rest of our careers. But yeah, absolutely to the point. Anyone that's coming into the profession now, if they choose to use SIPs as the right career path, they're going to learn category management and they're going to learn asset management and all of that good stuff. But there's a lot of professionals out there right now that have kind of earned some scars along the way in the last 5 years, and that should be shared. It's that knowledge pass, that knowledge handover that we've all experienced. It should be shared because that makes us all better.
Yeah, I think it brings together our conversation to a kind of conclusion very nicely, because ultimately the lessons that were learned over COVID, made it so much more important, and kind of not forced procurement, but maybe forced them, but also allowed procurement to have to very, very quickly understand, what does the business do? What does the business need? And how can I help?
Yep.
So, really interesting to hear your points of view on that. And look, I really enjoyed that conversation. I'm glad we managed to get ourselves together on it. I know you're super busy, and it's great that we managed to actually get together and do this. And hopefully we're going to be lining up a bit more of a detailed conversation about some other areas that we can bring in at a later point in time. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yeah,
but
I'd like that.
Thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And it sounds like some exciting times ahead.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Cheers.